As a kid, there was nothing more exciting and pleasant than the days when I got to go to my grandmother's house. I called her Mams. And don't mistake Mams for your stereotypical Appalachian granny, because she wasn't. I mean, sure, she had a little farm, she canned her own vegetables at home, made handmade quilts and things of that nature, but that's about as far as the similarities go. At least the ones you probably have in mind. I had the same notions about her for the first 9 years of my life. The year I was 10, I spent the entire summer with Mams. She lived alone, and I think she was glad of the company. Or maybe she was just trying to make me feel better about being dumped on her doorstep by my dad. I remember he made such a fuss about wanting her to keep me that they argued. Mams said, "You know, I can't be here all the time with him, and I can't take him with me when I go to work. He just ain't old enough." Instead of trying to talk to her like a decent man, Dad scoffed and said, "You still call that devil shit your work? Well, it's no wonder why Dad died. You probably brought something home that killed him." He stormed off the porch, dragged a heavy duffel bag with all my clothes in it, and dropped it on the ground before speeding off down the long dirt driveway. I stood on the top porch steps staring after him until the rooster tails of dust disappeared. Ma'am shook her head and looked at me with a smile. "Don't you fret, boy. We'll have the best summer in history." She tweaked my cheek and winked. "And if nothing else, we'll do it to spite him." She nodded in the direction Dad had gone. I nodded and smiled as best I could, but I was young and my heart was hurt that he wanted to get rid of me so bad. "Would you go grab your bag and come inside?" She waited me at the screen door. "Who wants cookies and cakes?" "And ice cream?" I asked, already brimming with excitement. "Laws a day, boy. I ain't made ice cream in an age." She laughed and ushered me into the kitchen. "Grandma, you do know they sell ice cream in the grocery store, right?" I asked, rolling my eyes. "I know very well, but I'm sort of locked into the old ways." She paused and turned slowly toward me. I remember the look in her eyes. Well, it kind of scared me. It was dark and felt sinister. "One day, you might be too," she said. Then her demeanor changed. She smiled that bright smile that I loved so much and started singing the Ballad of Tom Dooley. It was her favorite song. Now fast forward a couple of weeks. The scary incident had been completely forgotten, replaced with berry picking, ice cream making, and farm chores. I had been out playing and had gone inside to grab a homemade biscuit and some of Mam's fresh canned wild raspberry jam. She was singing in the kitchen. "Oh, death, won't you spare me over till another year?" She sang in a soft, low voice. I stopped beside her. "More cakes? Or is it cookies this time, Mams?" I leaned to get a look at what she was making. It looked like thick cookies. Some were in the shape of coffins. Some were round with the outline of a skull impressed into their centers. "Halloween ain't for months. Those'll be trash by then," I complained. "Oh, Lord, child, these ain't for no holiday. They're funeral cakes." A chill ran over my arms and I backed up several steps. I'd never heard of funeral cakes, but they sounded awful. "Ew, why would you serve skull-faced and coffin-shaped cakes at a funeral? You're supposed to make a casserole or a meatloaf for the family. I don't think they're gonna like that." I pointed to the countertop behind her. "Well, it ain't for no bereaved family either." She sighed and dusted the flour from her hands. "They're for my job." "I didn't know you worked a job, Mams," I said slowly, sitting in the chair at the table. "I thought it was just you and the farm and the stuff you sell from here. I thought that's how you made money." She nodded as she walked to the table and took the seat across from me. Fixing me with that scary, dark look again, she said, That's just how I survive out here all alone. When my job is why I'm out here all alone. Well, how many times have you seen company at my house? Never? Well, how many times I ever took you to town? How many times have you ever heard me talking about my friends? The answer was the same, and until that moment, I'd never thought about it either. That's just how Mams was. She lived on the farm alone, and that's just how it had always been. I never even considered why. Samuel, you listen up, and you listen good, 'cause I don't chew my cabbage twice, you hear? I nodded. Yeah, sure, yes, ma'am, She was only going to say whatever it was once, and I better not come asking questions later, because she wasn't going to repeat any of it. Your Mams is what folks call a sin-eater. Before you get all worked up like that no good daddy of yours, it ain't devil work. It's necessary work. You see, people around here need me to do this, not just for the sake of their dead loved ones, but for the whole of the mountain community, you and your daddy included. She pointed toward the southern window. You know old Ferguson down that way, don't you? Yeah, he shot my friend Timmy's dog and nailed it to the side of his barn because it killed one of his chickens. Nobody likes him. Well, that's right. He's even meaner than your daddy ever thought about being. But that man has an eternal soul, just like everybody else. Now, he was dying about 2 hours ago when his daughter came here, and I suppose she'll be back any minute to fetch me. And when she does, you can't come with me. I have to go eat Mr. Ferguson's sins, so he could go on to heaven and not be stuck here to turn into an old haint. She stood and turned back to the gruesome little cakes. Or worse in his case. I argued that no one could eat someone else's sins. That's not how Preacher Pendlin taught us anyway, but Mams was having none of it. She shut me down with a final warning that I was to stay at the house while she tended to her work at the Fergus farm. Mams left the house with the cakes in a basket covered with a white linen napkin. Mr. Fergus's daughter came driving up that driveway to fetch Mams only a couple of minutes later. I ran down the hill to the left of the house, and I tramped through the grass that was as tall as me, and then I went into the woods up to a steep rise, grabbing roots and bushes to pull myself along. Down the other side was a trail full of washouts and deep ruts. At the end of the trail, there was a small field where Mr. Fergus raised corn for his livestock, but there was nothing there. I could see past the barn and all the way to the big willow at the back of the house. Mams and Fergus's daughter had already parked at the side of the house, and there were a bunch of people there. Mams stood just outside the sheltering branches of the willow, and I ran to the barn to make sure I stayed out of sight. The bloodstain from Timmy's dog was big brownish and went above my head all the way to the ground. Grimacing and barely holding down my breakfast, I sneaked back into the woods just a few feet, and I made my way quiet-like toward the house so I could get closer to what was happening under the willow branches. Mams was the only person speaking. I couldn't understand what she was saying. It was in a different language, I think. I moved sideways, tree to tree, until Mams came into view. She stood at the head of a table. Mr. Fergus was dead, all right. Dead and laid out on that table. His daughter was handing Mams 2 big dinner rolls right over that corpse. She held them down low, like an inch above her dead daddy's chest. Mams laid one on his forehead and the other on his chest, and she spoke some more in that other language as the daughter handed her a glass with some brownish liquid in it. "You let this bread rise on his chest and forehead?" Mams asked the daughter. The daughter nodded, but didn't make eye contact with Mams. Mams pointed toward the basket of funerary cakes on a chair behind the daughter. You hand me a cake for every dozen sins you know for sure your daddy committed, and you be honest, this ain't the time for speaking easy of the dead. Not if you want 'em to go to heaven. The daughter picked up the basket, looked under the linen napkin, and sobbed. Can you fit 24 or maybe more sins in each cake? After a moment, Mams nodded. Well, if that's what it takes to save his soul. Ain't too much worried about him to go to heaven. I just don't want his spirit stuck here where I gotta deal with him for the rest of my life. Been miserable because of him for 45 years. She shoved the whole basket to Mams over her father's chest. Just give me peace, Mams. Mams gobbled down both the rolls, all 12 cakes, and chased them with whatever was in that glass. I stood with my eyes wide and my hands clamped over my mouth. It was disgusting. Why would she eat food that had been on a corpse? The wind rose and the birds fell silent. On the ground, leaves from the previous fall rattled like old bones as the wind picked up stronger. It rushed past Mams, sending her gray-streaked hair flying wild, and then it whirled the dead leaves around my shins. I wanted to run, but I couldn't. If Mams found out I was there, she would be mad, and I didn't want anyone who could eat bread off of a dead man's body to be mad at me. I was thinking that was probably why she didn't have friends, and why no one ever came to her house. Thunder rolled in from the west, thunder from a clear blue sky. The crowd backed away from Mams and Mr. Fergus's body. The cadaver jerked like somebody had shocked it. The arms fell off the side of the table and dangled lifelessly. I bit into one of my hands to keep the scream locked inside. Mams opened her arms wide right over Mr. Fergus's head, put her face towards the sky, and opened her mouth in a silent scream. Fergus jittered against the table. His heels thudded the wood like he was trying to run, and his back arched, and his mouth and eyes flew wide open. Now, for an instant, I thought Mams had somehow resurrected the old man, and I think I was screaming by then. But the shrill voices screaming out of Mr. Fergus were louder. Black and gray smoke billowed from his gaping mouth, his hands clenched into fists, and blood ran from his eyes. The smoke rose higher and higher, almost to the top of that willow tree. There were horrible faces and twisted bodies in the smoke, all tangled up with each other and writhing like a bundle of snakes. The old man's body thumped back to the table, limp and dead as ever. His fist unclenched and his feet stilled. Then the writhing mass of black and gray smoke took a downward turn and spiraled right into Mam's mouth like a freight train. It looked like she expanded to twice her size, like she was busting at the seams, and then it was over. The wind laid down again, and the thunder stopped, and Mams crumpled to the ground. No one offered to help her get up. They all just walked away real slow, some of the women going toward the daughter, others toward the side door of the house, and they all just left Mams to get up. Or not. I wanted to run and help her, but fear locked my legs. When she hauled herself off of the ground and started toward the trail I had been on earlier, terror seized my heart. How would I get back home before she did, if she was taking the same route that I was meant to take? When Mams made it to the side of the barn and was out of sight, I looked back one last time to Mr. Fergus. His daughter and another woman were crossing his arms over his chest, and somehow he looked more peaceful than when I had first seen him. Of course, puking out all the bad stuff would probably make anybody more peaceful, dead or alive. Realizing I was going to have to run the longer route home, I started to run up the mountain behind me. and I hit Mams. I screamed and was falling backward off that steep bank, and one hand shot from her side and grabbed my shirt collar. All my screams died, and I think my guts froze as she pulled me back up and set my feet on solid ground like she was a lumberjack or something. The dark look had been replaced with a look I can only say was fired by insanity, and her grin looked bloodthirsty. "Well, I told you to stay at home," she growled. I'm so sorry, Mams." I was too scared to cry, too scared to offer excuses. How the hell had she gotten there in an instant, from 200 feet away, or maybe farther? She bared her teeth and her face contorted like she was in great pain. After what I'd witnessed, I'd no doubt that she was. Turning her face away, she said, "Let's go." Not letting go of my shirt, she started walking. Where, Mams?" I asked, tripping over my own feet. Yanking me close to her face, she screamed a single word loud enough to make me clamp my hands over my ears. "Home." Her stride was short, stilted and jerky, and she kept hold of my shirt, forcing me to walk sideways. I don't think I even looked at the ground once on that long journey back to her house. She looked straight ahead, and I didn't want to do anything to draw her ferocious gaze back to me. Every few steps, she gnashed her teeth at the air like a dog snapping its jaws at a steak held just out of reach. She snarled and growled like a rabid wolf each time she did it, and mingled voices screamed from deep within her chest. Terror and relief welled up inside of me when the farmhouse came into view. I was relieved to see the big, rambling white house. It was something normal, something rational, something I can make sense out of. The chickens that usually flocked to Mams ran from us. The cows bolted from the fence line where they had been serenely gazing. The goats jumped their fence. One got its leg hung up and screamed as it dangled. Its cries seemed to panic the others further, and some used it as a means to boost themselves on over the tall enclosure. But oddly enough, it was that goat's pained screams that finally caused me to start crying. I couldn't help it. My breath hitched, and Mams spun to face me. She dragged me real close. She saw the tears, and leaned close to inspect them with her eyebrows drawn down to the bridge of her nose. There were bloody streaks in her eyes, and the color had changed from their normal icy light blue to a deep, dark, mossy green. "The goat," I whimpered, wishing I could close my eyes. I guess true fear does weird things to a body. Everything on me seemed to have shut down and gone lax. Everything but my eyes. She sniffed at my face like an animal, and then the most horrible experience I've ever had happened. She licked a tear from my cheek. Her tongue was like wet, aged, worn leather, and it smelled like death. I don't really have clear memories of what happened after I started screaming and thrashing. The next clear memory I do have is one of me standing in the yard feeding the chickens. I was throwing feed to them from a little metal bucket, and they were clucking happily as they pecked the food from the ankle-high grass. The sun was at its highest point. It was noon, the sky was cloudless, and the breeze was light and warm. Everything on the farm looked as normal as it had ever been. I looked down at myself, and at some point, I had bathed and changed into clean clothes. So you can't imagine how confused I was. The screen door banged and I spun around, ready to light out of there if Mams was... "Samuel?" she called. She was holding a pitcher of lemonade in one hand and a plate of little sandwiches in the other. and her smile was that same sweet, serene smile that I loved so much. There was no trace of the vicious, monstrous ma'ams that I had witnessed at Mr. Fergus's house. My mouth dropped open, and I stared at her. Was she a dream? Had the other ma'ams only been a nightmare? "Well, now come on, boy," she said sweetly, setting the pitcher and plate on the little wooden table. "Well, I know you've got to be starving. I'll get the glasses and the plates, and I'll be right back." She mentioned for me to get on up there. I felt like I was in a dream, kind of disconnected from the world as I walked toward the steps. Was I walking on my own, or was I being pulled by a force I couldn't see and couldn't understand? See, that's what it felt like, and either way, I ended up in a chair staring at the sandwiches. Some had been cut with a biscuit cutter. They were round. The others were rectangles, the same shapes as the strange, macabre funeral cakes. She hummed the tune to Bringing in the Sheaves. As she came back with the glasses and plates, she poured the lemonade and set a glass in front of me. "Eat up, Samuel. You've been working hard all morning in this heat. Well, I'm surprised you ain't had a heat stroke." She placed 2 pimento cheese sandwiches and 1 ham and cheese on a plate and set it gently in front of me. "You all right, son? Were you looking I might peek it?" She touched my forehead with soft, cool fingers. "Why don't you drink that lemonade? You're burning up." I wondered had I dreamed the whole thing, that I have some sort of brain seizure that caused me to imagine it and lose my whole morning. At her urging, I took a sip of the drink. "Ma'ams?" My voice was barely louder than a whisper. I cleared my throat and I tried again, but it still sounded thin and weak. "What is it?" She looked worried, fretful even, just like ma'ams would look if something was wrong with me. "How long have I been out of bed?" She blinked at me several times, looked out at the chickens I'd been feeding, and then back to me. "Well, since before daylight. Well, you said you felt much better at breakfast and you wouldn't hear of staying inside for a few more days to make sure. Are you feeling all right, honey? You got back to work too soon, didn't you?" She came back and put her palm against my forehead. "Well, I told you it was too soon, boy. God, you never listen. You just like your daddy." I pulled away from her. "I saw you at Mr. Fergus's house, ma'ams." She recoiled and sat in her chair. "I know you did, and I told you to stay home that day. That wasn't meant for no boy your age to see. Now look at the shape you're in because you didn't listen to me." "That day?" "Yes, Friday last," she said, nodding and wearing a disapproving look. My guts twisted. Hadn't all that happened just the day before? Well, what's today? "It's Thursday." The look of disapproval morphed back into pure concern. "You don't know what day it is. Well, I think I'd better send for Doc Hyder to come back. You're not well yet." "Ma'ams, it can't be Thursday. You're lying to scare me because I didn't stay home like you told me. I saw you change into that monster. You dragged me home by my shirt. That was yesterday, and this is Saturday. Stop lying to me, ma'ams." The words gushed from me like a river bursting through a dam. The world fell over on its side and everything turned black. The next time I opened my eyes, I was on the couch and old Doc Hyder was standing over me. "There you are, Sammy. Well, you gave your ma'ams quite a fright, you did," he said with a smile. Something stung my arm and I jerked. Doc pushed my arm back down and the sting worsened for a second, and then it was gone. He'd given me a shot and my eyes wouldn't stay open. Doc roughed my hair and stood, and I heard his shoes tapping at the floor as he walked away toward the kitchen. "He'll be fine. I gave him a tranquilizer to keep him calm so he could sleep," Doc said in his low, calm voice. "But he saw everything," Ma'am's voice answered. Doc chuckled. Well, why don't you just tell him it was a nightmare brought on by breathing the mold in the Fergus's barn or something? He'll believe it if you're convincing enough. What if he don't? There was a pause. Does he know he's next in line to take over your job, Mams? No, Mams exclaimed quietly. Never told him. Well, that's why he was supposed to stay home. Well, he was infected with at least some of Mr. Fergus's sins because of your negligence. Because you touched him before you could get them to lay still inside yourself. His voice was accusing, hard. I'd never heard him speak that way, and he'd been the family doc since I could remember. I went to sleep then, and I didn't hear any more of their hushed conversation. But I remembered what I'd heard when I woke up again, and I played along with that cockeyed story about me breathing some kind of mold when I was at Mr. Ferguson's barn, which I had not gone inside of, mind you. But I didn't argue. I asked to go home every morning and every evening after that. Mams finally agreed after several days, though she did act hurt. We walked home, and I was terrified while we were in the woods. The whole time I imagined that she would change back into that monster and kill me, leave my corpse for the raccoons and possums and buzzards. My dad was beyond angry that I was back. I never told him why I was back, and Mams gave him a shabby story about me breathing mold spores and getting sick. I could see from the look on his face that he didn't buy it for a second, but he never asked me what really happened, and I never told him. My daddy died when I was 18. Mams came to the house. I put an envelope into her hand, told her it was the money for his funeral, told her the house and everything in it was hers, and I left. I just turned 25, and I'm back at home. Nothing changed since the day I walked out, and I'm only back because Mams died a few weeks ago. The lawyer said both places were mine now. I tried to get him to sell the property and the houses and give the money to his favorite charity, but I guess that's just not how things work. During this past week, the memory of Mams as that monstrous thing are fresh and vivid as I go through the house, boxing up things to donate to charity, and I can't sleep more than a couple hours at a time. Well, just yesterday morning, I woke up standing in the kitchen singing the Ballad of Tom Dooley, a song I had purposefully not thought of since I was 10. And even this morning, I woke up while I was opening the oven. There were 6 small round cakes with the impressions of skulls in their center on one sheet pan. On the other, 6 little coffin-shaped cakes. I expect someone will be knocking at the door before bedtime to ask for my services. I don't know how I know this, but I do. I don't know if I could say no when the time comes to perform the age-old ritual. I don't even know the words that Mams was speaking over Mr. Fergus that day. All I know is that this is how it's supposed to be. And the strangest thing about it is that I'm okay with that. You see, some kids inherit grandma's pretty blue eyes or her bubbly attitude. Some kids inherit dad's tractor, or maybe his real estate business. But how many people could say they inherited something as unique as being a sin eater? Well, deep down, I know I'll understand how Mams lived all those years in solitude without it bothering her. My guess is, after the first ritual, I'll never truly be alone again.